and thank you again, Valentina, for being the ultimate hype woman and MC. I really appreciate you plugging my book as well. Thank you for that lovely intro, and obviously I couldn't be there with you live today for CMX Summit 2020 because of technical difficulties, so thank you for your patience. I figured this was the next best thing because I know this is a really popular session and I wanted to make sure we engaged in the conversation about how to be a more inclusive community leader. So let's get to it. Today we're going to be looking at why there is no passive way to build inclusion in communities. We're also going to look at how community leaders like yourselves can foster inclusion and belonging by running towards your biases. You'll see what I mean. And finally, what you can do to prioritize psychological safety for your communities to thrive. So before we dive in, I figured it would be good to quickly introduce myself. My name is Fabella. I am a DEI, that's diversity, equity, and inclusion, and remote team expert. So I specialize in helping companies such as PepsiCo, Google, and Standard & Poor's to foster inclusion for their distributed teams. I host the 5-star rated Inclusion in Progress podcast, where every week I share up-to-date insights and expert interviews with what's happening in DEI around the world. I'm also a published author, as Valentina mentioned, a keynote speaker, and an award-winning visibility coach for minority leaders. But since all of you are quite literally in my home right now as I'm giving this talk, it's only fair that you get to know me a little bit better. So aside from my professional accomplishments, I'm also a second-generation US-born daughter of immigrants, an immigrant myself, now in Spain since 2010. It seems like immigration runs in the family. I'm a Filipino-American woman of color. I'm a native English speaker, a fluent Spanish speaker, pretty proficient GIF speaker, sci-fi and comic book fan, a cat mama of 2, a musical lover, a yogi who tries to practice, keyword being tries, and according to Myers-Briggs, an INFJ. So I'm often what I refer to with my clients as a multi-hyphenate, which means there are more aspects to my identity than meets the eye. And as we learned when this coronavirus pandemic hit, we got to see more of our hidden identities and hyphens than ever before. And in our work in DEI building inclusion, we often speak about helping one another bring our whole selves to work, which of course looks a little bit different in pandemic times when we take our masks off, so to speak, in a remote working environment. So basically, whenever someone would ask me during the pandemic, "How are you, Kay?" I started answering with, "I am a 7-layer cake of emotions." Because being a multi-hyphenate who works in DEI in a global pandemic meant that I was a multitude of things. I was hosting virtual birthday parties and happy hours with friends and family on Zoom. I was navigating client calls with global clients in the home office that I share with my Spanish partner, Javi, and having to deal with hourly ambulance sirens in the background, cheering every night for our frontline workers at 8 p.m. during lockdown. I was scared when my father-in-law was hospitalized for the virus at the start of the pandemic, and thankfully was relieved when he made a recovery. And in the midst of all of this, I was saddened whenever I left the house to buy groceries because of the xenophobia that I would receive as someone most Spaniards physically identified as Chinese. I was doing my best to check in with as many loved ones as I could, like my dad seeing patients in Los Angeles or my cousin who was a newly minted doctor out in the Philippines. I was trying to find mental health breaks and, holding space for other people's emotions whenever I could. And in the midst of it all, searching for moments of gratitude and ways that I could contribute to serve those who were struggling. So the way that I saw it, it made answering this question of how are you a lot easier because nobody has time for that whole story every time. And honestly, cake really does make everything better. But if there is a silver lining to this pandemic, it's that we're realizing the importance of communities in helping us feel safe and supported during this crisis. 2020 has given us an opportunity to really slow down and remember what is most important in life, our relationships. Because yes, learning TikTok dances and making sourdough starter kits or binging Netflix and braving this new world of back-to-back Zoom calls are all well and good. But we all know that none of this is normal. And not gonna lie, as much as this introvert is thrilled at getting to deliver this keynote to you all from the comfort of her home in Madrid with the sirens in the background, which I don't know if you're catching, but there they are, I know how much we all miss these moments of connection from our pre-corona lives. And we are absolutely allowed to grieve for what we've lost. But if we stay in this place of missing the old way of doing things, we're never going to stay in this headspace that we need to be in to lead the people who are continuing to depend on us. So rather than using this phrase of new normal, which I think is quite done, let's embrace this next normal and try and find ways to contribute to those who need us from a place of possibility. So we can reframe this challenge as an opportunity to start reimagining who the world is, what the world is, rather, that we want to create and who we get to be on the other side. The good news is that every single one of us has the power to shape this future, starting with the communities that we lead. Now, with so many of us working safely from home for the foreseeable future, many companies have realized that remote work works. And in fact, according to Buffer's 2020 State of Remote Work, 98% of people surveyed would like to have the option to work remotely for the rest of their careers. So that means that as more people are working from home, staying connected through communities like the ones that you lead is going to be even more important. Not only that, but how people self-identify and who is going to be joining our communities in the future is also changing quickly. According to US Census data, the United States will become a majority-minority country in 2045, meaning that racial and ethnic minorities will make up the majority of the population. And we're seeing similar demographic trends like this happening all around the world. But it's not just about people being born today. The future workforce, particularly Gen Z, is more diverse than ever. There are more women, there are more people of color, there are more than twice the number from the baby boomer generation who identify as LGBTQ in Gen Z. In fact, according to 2018 study by Culture Amp, for every 100 straight white men that are leaving the workforce, only 66 straight white men are coming in to replace them. So the people who are joining our companies within the next 10 years will also completely reshape how our communities look like too. So as a community leader, prioritizing inclusion for diverse members is more important than ever, especially as our future work changes. We know that the strongest relationships are created and cultivated in the communities we lead, where people find a safe space to belong and be themselves with each other. And that's more important as we keep working remotely, even long after this pandemic ends. So, what does leading a community look like in the future of work? Well, over the past year, I've spent most of my time working with big tech firms and was intrigued to hear how they were navigating this mass shift to distributed teams. So much so that at the end of April, we decided to host an executive roundtable with representatives from Google, from Amazon, from Tesla, from DoorDash, and GitHub. And our intention was to gather insights to share what other inclusion-minded leaders were doing and help guide organizations with these insights through this historic time. We took the key findings from that roundtable and put together a white paper at the end of May. Now, the general consensus from the roundtable was that companies must continue to be agile so that they can adapt to the needs of their different employee groups who are dealing with the crisis, as well as focusing on inclusive communication to sustain productivity and engagement while working remotely. Now, the primary concern of everybody at the roundtable was their historically excluded team members who were already struggling with equity at work before coronavirus, because they realized that even though we are all in this storm together, not all of us have the same vessels to navigate this storm. with COVID-19, racism, xenophobia, caregiving, and mental health challenges combined, the last thing that they wanted was to see anyone fall behind. So if they're female employees, employees of color, members of the LGBTQ, neurodiverse, or disabled communities were already struggling with visibility in a face-to-face setting, they knew they'd likely be held back by systemic challenges in a remote working environment. Which is why they turned to their communities, their ERGs, employee resource groups, for ways to make sure that their strategies to take care of their people were adapting to serve the needs of their different groups. And for every single one of the companies that I spoke to, their internal communities, these ERG leaders, were the key to making sure their team stayed connected and engaged during this pandemic. Which makes sense, right? Leaders like you are already uniquely positioned to provide support for people in overcoming some of the hardest moments that we can remember, from the COVID-19 pandemic to the global anti-racism movement. When times get tough, leaning on people who understand you and who make you feel less alone is where community leaders like you truly shine. You're the ones who are going to lead people through this storm and safely to the other side of it. Which leads me to my next point. What can we learn from this past year to create truly inclusive environments for our diverse communities today and tomorrow? Especially when we now know that there are some being more disproportionately impacted by things beyond their control, such as mental health, inequality, or systemic racism. Now, the first thing I'm about to say is a bit more on the controversial side, but to be an inclusive community leader, you have to start by running towards your biases. Okay, hear me out. Verna Myers, the incredible VP of Inclusion at Netflix, first shared this concept in her powerful TED Talk, and I couldn't agree more. Because to become an inclusive leader, you have to acknowledge your own blind spots in order to help others overcome their own. And to clarify, I'm not saying that we bust out our isms and phobias and give in to our baser instincts, like our friend the Hulk here. But instead, I invite you to get curious about your biases, because you and I are human. We all have them. And even though our brains are capable of complex thought processes, they're also kind of lazy. They look for a pattern or an easy explanation for something that they see and don't understand right away. And many of those easy explanations that pop into our brains are stereotypes and sweeping assumptions that we just automatically reach for, which are simply not true. So instead of feeling guilty about your biases, embrace them so that you can start unpacking and understanding them in order to undo them. Because you cannot control the first thought that pops into your head when you see someone who is different or other. But you are responsible for the second conscious thought, and then the first action that you take to make the person in front of you feel seen, welcome, and heard. So ask yourself, what can you learn to become a better leader by running towards your biases so you can create belonging for your members? Now let's look at the second way that you can build inclusion in your community, by empowering collaboration and collision. Here's what I mean. I think many of us, especially community leaders who are such people, have a deep desire to create spaces where everyone feels welcome all the time. But the reality is, as demographics change, as members become more diverse, culturally, ethnically, professionally, and personally, there will be moments where we just don't understand each other. Moments where one of us will intentionally or unintentionally make someone feel excluded instead of included. And like in any family, conflict is going to happen between members with different perspectives and worldviews. So what is our role then as leaders? Well, you have the very active, ongoing job of helping your members feel both supported and free to be who they are. Ultimately, communities are containers for ongoing conversations between people around a shared interest or a cause or the like. So in order to make sure that that conversation continues effectively, inclusive leaders must establish ground rules and guidelines to help members feel comfortable bringing their whole selves, to feel like they're safe to share who they are when they feel vulnerable, and safe to respectfully disagree or speak up, especially when they experience exclusion or discrimination. Which is why there is no passive way for you to build inclusion in your community as a leader. You must take a stand. You must regularly engage with your members to adapt to their needs, to listen to what they want, and as it changes from year to year and month to month, and adapt accordingly, while at the same time educating yourself on how you can best handle the spectrum of situations as they arise. So once you've acknowledged your biases, you have to make a commitment to educating yourself, which is an ongoing process. And I speak from experience here. Even as a practitioner, there is still so much that I'm learning on a daily basis about my own biases and my own blind spots. I mean, just look at how many pillars there are within the DEI conversation. But rather than being overwhelmed, I try my best to approach this work with curiosity, with humility, and with a good deal of patience. I see the ways that if I learn to be better today, I will be able to do better for others tomorrow. Because yes, I have a personal entry point into the diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation as a woman of color, as a daughter of immigrants, and an immigrant myself. At the same time, I am also a cisgender, able-bodied woman, a fluent English speaker and Spanish speaker. So there are plenty of ways that I can leverage the privileges that I do have to raise the floor and do better for others. And the same goes for you as a community leader. Inclusion should be the lens through which you lead. When you make the commitment to understanding and dismantling your own blind spots and biases, you set the tone, which means you get to empower your members to engage in the conversation through collaboration and conflict, and help you in the process to co-create inclusion with them for the community as a whole. Which leads perfectly into our final point, psychological safety. Now, this is a term that gets thrown around a lot, so I want to make sure that I define it. Psychological safety was first highlighted by Amy Edmondson, an organizational behavioral scientist. And she defined it as this: a shared belief by members of a team that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking, describing a team climate that's characterized by interpersonal trust and mutual respect, in which people are comfortable being themselves. So Google realized the importance of psychological safety and launched Project Aristotle back in 2012 in order to find out what it takes to build the most effective team possible. Project Aristotle consisted of hundreds of interviews and the analysis of data taken from over 100 active teams at Google. And the key finding, above all else, was that psychological safety was crucial to ensuring that a team works well together. And the same is true for our communities. So, how exactly do we build psychological safety for members in a virtual environment? Well, the first way is to create clear codes of conduct for different channels and events. For live events such as this one, we establish our boundaries and expectations with attendees at the start of the meeting or the event or the virtual call. Then we make sure that those expectations are honored for the duration of the event and in the post-event debrief and your email or your newsletter afterwards. And these codes of conduct could be as simple as asking people to mute themselves on a Zoom call or providing a way for participants to submit anonymous questions when you're discussing more difficult topics. The second way is to create clear chains of command and communication, so that when collisions such as misunderstandings or discrimination happen, there is a clear place for people to go. Now, this code of conduct that I mentioned before should be shared with all of your new members before they join, so they know what your community represents and what it doesn't. And then it should be made easily available for everyone to see and search for should those questions or challenges arise. Now, a good example of a rule that you can use in this code of conduct is something such as assume ignorance, not intent. And that way you're helping members self-regulate if they feel that their psychological safety is being threatened. And then letting them know within that code of conduct what the respective feedback channels are if they need to talk to one of your leaders directly. The last way is to aim for psychological safety by communicating often and regularly with your members. Now, this is where it's key to have a multi-pronged communication strategy. So you're using both asynchronous channels like Slack or a newsletter, or synchronous channels, real-time things such as these live events. Now, not every group's virtual ecosystem is going to look the same, and we don't have enough time for that in today's talk. So my advice for you is to imagine you were one of your newest members joining your community for the first time, hopping onto a Zoom call or engaging with a newsletter from you. If they didn't know anything about you, your group, or your mission, what would you want them to feel right away? Or on the flip side of that question, what impression would you like to avoid giving them when they join your community for the first time? Because when we don't have the benefit of body language or verbal cues in this virtual environment, leaning towards over-communication can help avoid unnecessary misunderstandings. So when planning for the future of your community in 2020, 2021, and beyond, make sure to budget in time for creating content for regular communication with your members and making sure that the structures that you're building prioritize psychological safety. A little extra effort goes a long way in building this foundation. So today we've looked at why there is no passive way to build inclusion in communities, how community members and leaders like yourselves can foster belonging by running towards your biases, and lastly, what you can do to prioritize psychological safety for your communities to continue to thrive in this pandemic and beyond. Now, as we come to the conclusion of our time together, I want to leave you with a few final thoughts as you prepare for the months and years to come. There are so many opportunities for us to break out of our traditional community structures, in addition to our calendars and the things that we normally went for to bring our people together. If the pandemic has taught us anything, it's creativity, how to connect with our people, and how to make sure that we're supporting one another in this very strange, very surreal time. And it's also made us more aware than ever about the state of our world and the inequities that we could very conveniently ignore in our pre-corona lives. So the spotlight is now on you as community leaders. We are the steady hearts and hands that people desperately need, especially now. And in a way, this is what you've been training for, which is why your community needs you to step up and lead, no matter who you are, what you look like, where you come from, who you love, or what your beliefs are. And now it's up to you to answer that call. And of course, if you'd like to continue this conversation with me, head over to my website, kfabella.com, to download our white paper, or you can find me on LinkedIn or Twitter and let me know what you'd like to learn to make your community more inclusive moving forward. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the summit.